If authority could be seen the moment it enters a room, silence would follow it everywhere. On a crisp morning in Washington, D.C., the steps leading up to the state Supreme Court building were already filled with movement, cameras, and the quiet tension of another high-profile session about to begin. Among the flow of lawyers, clerks, and security personnel, a woman walked alone, her presence calm and unhurried, dressed in a simple dark coat that gave no immediate hint of the position she held within the highest levels of the state judiciary. Her name was Rachel Williams, a state Supreme Court justice known across legal circles for her sharp reasoning and unwavering commitment to the law. Yet to anyone glancing from a distance, she appeared like just another professional arriving at work. At the same time, Officer Derek Collins stood near the restricted access entrance, a uniformed police officer assigned to perimeter security, his posture rigid and his tone already carrying the impatience of someone who believed authority was defined only by what could be seen. As Rachel approached the entrance, Derek stepped forward, his attention narrowing on her as if she did not belong in the flow of officials entering the building. And without checking credentials or waiting for clarification, he raised his voice just enough for nearby people to notice, questioning her presence with a dismissive edge that caused a few passing heads to turn. Rachel paused, not out of fear or hesitation, but out of observation, as if measuring the situation in silence, her expression steady and unreadable, while Derek continued speaking in a way that suggested certainty without evidence, assuming she was simply another civilian who had wandered too close to a restricted area. Around them, the morning routine continued, but subtle changes began to form. A courthouse clerk slowing their pace, a security monitor operator glancing twice at a screen, and a passing journalist lowering their phone as recognition flickered in their expression, though none of them spoke yet. Rachel's calm demeanor did not shift, but there was something in her stillness that did not match the way she was being addressed, a quiet contrast that began to unsettle those paying closer attention, while Derek's confidence remained fixed on the idea that he was in control of the interaction. He gestured toward the entrance as if directing her away, repeating instructions that suggested she should not be here, unaware that the entire building operated under layers of judicial authority that extended far beyond what his position allowed him to understand. A soft murmur began to move through the small crowd forming at a distance, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to signal recognition from those who had begun to realize who she might be, though no one confirmed it out loud. Rachel finally lifted her gaze fully to meet his, not with confrontation, but with clarity, as though she had already seen this moment before in different forms throughout her career, and the air between them shifted in a way that made the surrounding noise feel slightly distant. Derek, still unaware of what was unfolding beyond his immediate perception, continued speaking, reinforcing his assumption that authority was something he could enforce through presence alone, while Rachel remained composed, her silence carrying a weight that had not yet revealed its meaning. Inside the building, unseen systems of communication began to react subtly, a shift in internal alerts, a change in tone among staff, and the quiet anticipation of those who had just recognized that the person at the entrance was not someone who needed permission to enter, but someone whose arrival was already expected. The morning air outside the Supreme Court entrance carried a strange stillness, the kind that often comes just before a system quietly corrects itself. Officer Derek Collins remained positioned near the restricted access point, his attention still fixed on the woman in front of him, unaware that the environment around them had begun to shift in ways he could not yet interpret. Inside the building, subtle signals moved through internal channels, not alarms or public announcements, but coded confirmations exchanged between personnel who had suddenly recognized a name tied to the highest level of judicial authority. Rachel Williams stood in the same place, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if the unfolding tension did not require her participation. A courthouse clerk near the entrance slowed their steps, glancing between Rachel and a concealed screen embedded in their workstation, where a priority identification match had just appeared. The clerk did not speak, but their hesitation was enough to create a ripple of awareness among nearby staff. Derek noticed none of this, continuing to assert instructions as though authority could be maintained through repetition alone, gesturing toward the side entrance and reinforcing his assumption that she needed to be redirected. Rachel did not respond immediately, her silence carrying a weight that made the passing seconds feel structured rather than accidental. A few feet away, a security supervisor lowered their voice into a communication device, requesting confirmation of a high-level arrival notice that had just been logged into the system moments earlier. The response came quickly, short and precise, causing the supervisor's posture to straighten almost imperceptibly. Meanwhile, a journalist standing near the steps lowered their camera slightly, recognition beginning to surface as they compared the scene in front of them with information already circulating internally among legal correspondents. Derek shifted his stance, growing slightly more insistent, as if the lack of compliance from Rachel was challenging his perception of control. He spoke again, his tone still firm but now carrying a faint edge of impatience, unaware that several individuals within earshot had already stopped what they were doing to observe more closely. Rachel finally turned her head slightly, not away from him, but toward the building itself, as if acknowledging something beyond the immediate exchange. That small movement triggered a second wave of recognition among staff near the entrance, one of whom discreetly stepped back and adjusted their communication channel, signaling a higher clearance awareness alert. Derek's radio, clipped to his shoulder, emitted a brief interruption of static followed by a low-priority advisory tone, something he had been trained to recognize but not yet fully process in this context. He glanced down briefly, then back at Rachel, still unaware of the significance behind the change in internal communication. The atmosphere remained outwardly calm, but within the courthouse infrastructure, procedural adjustments were already being prepared, shifts in access permissions, and quiet coordination between security layers. Rachel's presence, though physically unchanged, now carried a different weight within the environment, as systems designed to respond to authority began aligning around her identity. Derek stood at the center of this unfolding misalignment, still operating under assumptions that were slowly becoming irrelevant to the situation developing around him. The subtle shift in the courthouse atmosphere continued to evolve as if the building itself had begun to quietly adjust its priorities without announcing it aloud. Officer Derek Collins remained near the restricted entrance, still unaware of the full significance behind the changes unfolding around him, though his attention was beginning to drift between the woman in front of him and the increasingly unusual behavior of the personnel behind him. Inside the internal operations network of the Supreme Court facility, confirmation protocols had escalated from preliminary identification to full validation, and what had begun as a simple recognition alert had now transitioned into a structured response sequence reserved only for the highest levels of judicial authority. Rachel Williams remained composed, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady and forward, as though she had already accounted for every possible outcome of the moment she was standing in. A nearby court officer quietly stepped away from their station, speaking into a secured communication channel in a low and controlled voice, requesting direct verification from Executive Protection Coordination. Within seconds, the response returned, not as speculation but as confirmation, and the expression on the officer's face shifted into quiet acknowledgement. Derek, still focused on enforcing what he believed to be standard procedure, repeated his instruction once more, though his voice now carried a slight hesitation that he himself did not fully recognize. The presence of multiple staff members subtly repositioning themselves near entry points began to register as unusual, though he did not yet connect the pattern forming around him. A journalist a few steps away lowered their device entirely, no longer recording casually but observing with intent, as if realizing the significance of the moment was no longer speculative but factual. Rachel's attention remained forward, but her awareness extended beyond the immediate interaction, as indicated by the slight adjustment in her stance, signaling recognition of the internal shift now fully underway. Inside the building, access permissions updated in real time across multiple security layers, clearing pathways that had previously been restricted, while discrete notifications confirmed the activation of a priority escort protocol. Derek's communication device emitted a second tone, more deliberate this time, signaling that the situation had moved beyond standard perimeter interaction, though he still had not been fully briefed on what that meant in this specific context. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in understanding but in growing uncertainty, as the environment around him began to behave in ways that contradicted his expectations of control. The courthouse steps, once filled with routine movement, had subtly reorganized into a quiet perimeter of awareness, with staff members no longer simply passing through but orienting themselves toward the center of the interaction. Rachel finally shifted her gaze slightly toward the entrance doors of the building, not reacting to Derek, but acknowledging the internal alignment that was now complete. That small movement coincided with the final confirmation signal being transmitted through the internal security network, indicating that executive presence had been fully verified and acknowledged. Derek, for the first time, paused without speaking, his posture tightening slightly as he sensed a change in authority dynamics that he could not yet define. The air around the entrance felt different, not louder or more chaotic, but structured in a way that suggested an imminent transition from uncertainty to formal recognition of identity and position, while Rachel remained still, waiting for the system around her to complete its own realization. The moment of stillness outside the courthouse entrance deepened into something more structured, as if unseen layers of authority were aligning into position without any visible signal to the public eye. Officer Derek Collins stood near the restricted access point, his earlier certainty now replaced by a growing sense of discomfort he could not fully articulate. The woman in front of him had not moved, yet the environment around her continued to shift in ways that contradicted every assumption he had made since the beginning of the encounter. Behind him, the courthouse entrance team had fully transitioned from routine observation to coordinated readiness, their attention no longer divided, but unified around a single point of recognition that had just been confirmed at the highest administrative level. Rachel Williams remained composed, her expression unchanged, her presence still quiet, but now carrying an undeniable weight that seemed to influence the behavior of everyone within proximity. A subtle adjustment occurred among the security personnel near the doors, with one officer stepping aside to clear a direct pathway that had not been available moments earlier. Derek noticed this movement and hesitated for the first time, his posture tightening slightly as he attempted to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed should be happening. A soft communication tone sounded from his shoulder radio, followed by a brief pause, then a second tone indicating updated priority instructions from Central Command. He glanced down briefly, his attention flickering between the device and the woman standing in front of him, as uncertainty began to replace the confidence that had guided his earlier actions. In the background, a courthouse assistant lowered their voice while speaking into a secure line, confirming that the executive protection unit had already been activated and was en route to the entrance. The surrounding atmosphere, while still visually calm, carried an unmistakable shift in structure, as if the building itself had moved from passive observation to active response. Rachel finally took a slow step forward, not in defiance, but in continuation, as though the space ahead of her had already been prepared for movement. That single motion caused a visible reaction among multiple staff members, who adjusted their positions in quiet synchronization, ensuring clear access along the central entry path. Derek instinctively stepped slightly to the side without fully realizing why, his earlier sense of authority now interrupted by an unfamiliar awareness that the situation was no longer under his operational control. The glass doors of the courthouse reflected the movement of personnel inside as internal protocols finalized their transition from identification to escort readiness. A final confirmation tone echoed through the internal network, signaling that full authorization had been verified and acknowledged across all relevant departments. Rachel's presence remained steady and calm, but the environment around her had fully adapted, aligning itself with her status in a way that required no further explanation. Derek remained standing at the edge of this shift, no longer issuing instructions, but instead observing as the reality of the situation began to settle in through silence rather than words. The quiet tension outside the courthouse entrance reached a level where even the smallest movement felt amplified by expectation rather than sound. Officer Derek Collins remained positioned slightly off to the side now, his earlier posture of control replaced by a more uncertain stance, as if he was no longer certain whether he was part of the situation or simply witnessing it unfold. The woman in front of him had not spoken further, Yet her presence seemed to redefine the space around the entrance in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. Behind the glass doors, the internal courthouse environment had shifted into a fully coordinated state, with personnel now moving according to confirmed protocols rather than routine behavior. Security officers who had previously been passive observers were now aligned along discrete positions, ensuring a clear and uninterrupted access path leading directly inside the building. Rachel Williams remained still for a brief moment longer, her expression calm and focused, as though she was allowing the environment to complete its adjustment before proceeding. A soft notification tone echoed from multiple communication devices in sequence, indicating synchronized confirmation across judicial protection channels. Derek glanced toward his radio again, noticing that the status indicator had changed once more, now displaying a priority escalation that he had not encountered in his current assignment before. He tightened his grip slightly on his equipment, not out of aggression, but from the discomfort of realizing that the situation was no longer responding to his authority or interpretation. A courthouse staff member near the entrance stepped back fully now, clearing space with deliberate precision, while another subtly gestured toward the interior corridor, as if confirming that the path forward had already been prepared. The surrounding environment, once filled with routine morning movement, had become structured in a way that suggested anticipation rather than confusion. Rachel finally moved forward again, taking another calm step toward the entrance, her motion unhurried but definitive, and this time no one attempted to obstruct or redirect her path. Derek instinctively shifted further aside without verbal instruction, his earlier certainty now replaced with a quiet awareness that every action around him was being guided by a system he was not controlling. The glass doors of the courthouse reflected the subtle repositioning of security personnel inside, their alignment forming a clear corridor that extended deeper into the building. A final internal communication signal passed through the network, confirming arrival authorization status and initiating the final stage of escort preparation. The atmosphere remained silent on the surface, yet beneath it, every layer of procedure had already transitioned into execution mode. Rachel paused just before crossing the threshold, not out of hesitation, but as if acknowledging the completion of a transition that others had only just begun to recognize. Derek remained at the edge of the entrance, no longer attempting to assert direction, his attention fixed on the unfolding order that was now clearly operating beyond his jurisdiction. The space between them, once defined by instruction and resistance, had transformed into a structured passage of authority, where movement was no longer questioned but simply aligned with confirmation already received. The final transition in atmosphere outside the courthouse entrance was no longer subtle, but fully established as a structured state of controlled awareness, where every movement and position had already been accounted for within an unseen operational framework. Officer Derek Collins stood near the side of the entryway, no longer attempting to assert direction or maintain procedural dominance, as the realization settled in that the situation was operating on a level of authority that extended far beyond his assigned role. The woman he had previously attempted to challenge remained calm at the threshold, her presence now fully integrated into the environment around her rather than being treated as an external disruption. Inside the courthouse, the escort protocol had fully activated, and personnel previously stationed in neutral positions were now aligned along a precise internal corridor that extended from the main entrance into the central judicial wing. Rachel Williams took a final measured step forward, crossing into the building with a composed expression that did not change despite the visible shift in behavior from every layer of security around her. A synchronized confirmation tone passed through multiple internal systems at once, signaling that all clearance validations had been completed and fully acknowledged across judicial protection channels. Derek's communication device emitted a final advisory signal, shorter and more decisive than before, indicating that his operational status had been superseded by higher authority directive. He lowered his gaze briefly, then returned his attention forward, now observing rather than participating in the situation unfolding in front of him. A senior courthouse security coordinator stepped into view ahead, maintaining a formal posture while acknowledging Rachel with a subtle nod that confirmed recognition without the need for verbal explanation. The surrounding personnel maintained precise spacing, ensuring an unobstructed path as she moved deeper into the entrance corridor, each step forward matched by quiet adjustments in positioning from staff on either side. The building's internal environment, once defined by standard morning operations, had now fully transitioned into an escort-controlled state, where movement was guided not by instruction but by pre-established authority hierarchy. Derek remained at the entrance threshold, no longer engaging, his role reduced to passive observation as the procedural structure around him completed its full activation cycle. Inside the corridor, lighting conditions subtly adjusted to reflect priority passage status, reinforcing the significance of the individual now moving through the space. Rachel's expression remained steady, her focus forward, as she continued along the designated path without interruption or hesitation. The silence within the corridor was not empty but organized, shaped by the disciplined coordination of personnel who now operated under confirmed executive judicial protocol. Each step she took forward was met with seamless environmental alignment, as doors, access points, and internal checkpoints responded in advance of her arrival. Derek's final visible reaction was a slight shift in posture, no longer rooted in authority or control, but in recognition that the framework he had been enforcing moments earlier had been completely replaced by a higher structured system already in motion. The passage ahead remained open and fully secured, and Rachel continued forward into the interior of the courthouse, where the full weight of institutional recognition now surrounded her presence without interruption. The interior of the courthouse had fully transitioned into a controlled environment of structured authority, where every corridor, checkpoint, and observation point now operated under synchronized awareness of the individual moving through it. Rachel Williams continued forward with steady composure, her presence no longer treated as an external variable but as the central reference point guiding all procedural alignment within the building. The escort corridor remained clear at all times, maintained by security personnel positioned with deliberate precision, their movements subtle and disciplined, ensuring uninterrupted passage toward the main judicial chamber. Officer Derek Collins was no longer part of the operational flow, remaining behind at the entrance threshold where his earlier assumptions about control and enforcement had been quietly superseded by higher-level authorization. Inside the corridor, communication channels remained active but subdued, with brief confirmation signals passing between departments to ensure continuity of protocol without disruption to the ongoing movement. Rachel's steps remained measured and calm, her expression unchanged as she advanced deeper into the structure, where the atmosphere reflected a complete transition from routine courthouse activity to executive judicial escort conditions. A senior court administrator stood at a junction ahead, observing her arrival with formal acknowledgement, stepping slightly aside to reinforce the uninterrupted nature of her passage. The lighting within the corridor subtly adjusted in response to her proximity, reflecting a pre-configured status recognition system designed for high-level judicial presence. Every element of the environment appeared to respond not to instruction in real time, but to pre-established confirmation that had already been validated across multiple layers of authority. Derek, now fully outside the active operational sequence, remained near the entrance where he had first attempted to assert control, his posture steady but his role reduced to observation as the institutional hierarchy around him completed its alignment. Inside, Rachel continued forward without pause, passing through each secured segment of the corridor as personnel maintained silent coordination on either side, ensuring that no interruption occurred in her path. The internal structure of the courthouse functioned now as a unified system of recognition and access, where movement was guided by confirmed status rather than procedural request. As she approached the central judicial wing, the environment reflected complete procedural synchronization, with access points ahead already prepared and secured in anticipation of her arrival. No verbal commands were issued, as none were required within a system that had already completed its verification cycle. Rachel's calm presence remained the focal point of the entire structure, and as she proceeded deeper into the courthouse, the final stage of her entry was marked not by announcement, but by seamless transition into the highest secured judicial space, where all preceding protocols converged into full institutional acknowledgement. Inside the central judicial wing, The environment had reached a level of formalized order where every movement, sound, and transition appeared governed by a pre-established hierarchy of recognition rather than spontaneous reaction. Rachel Williams continued forward through the final corridor, her presence now fully integrated into the operational structure of the courthouse, where staff members stood in quiet alignment along the perimeter, maintaining respectful distance and precise positioning as she advanced. The escort protocol that had begun at the entrance was now fully stabilized, extending into the core of the judicial floor where access points, seating arrangements, and administrative zones had already been prepared in advance of her arrival. A senior judicial coordinator stood near the entrance to the chamber ahead, holding a neutral but attentive posture, confirming final readiness through a brief visual acknowledgement rather than spoken instruction. Across multiple internal systems, confirmation logs had already been completed, indicating full recognition of her authority level within the state judicial framework, and all remaining procedures had transitioned into passive execution mode. Rachel's expression remained composed and focused, her movement steady as she approached the threshold of the main chamber, where proceedings were scheduled to begin under her oversight. Behind her, the corridor remained organized and silent, with personnel maintaining structured positions that reflected a complete understanding of the protocol now in effect. Officer Derek Collins, still positioned outside the primary operational flow, remained near the entrance zone where his earlier attempt to assert control had been fully overridden by institutional hierarchy, his attention now fixed on the realization that the system he once enforced had never been operating at his level of authority. Inside the chamber entrance, subtle adjustments were made by staff to ensure optimal readiness, including final verification of seating arrangement protocols and judicial support systems, all of which aligned automatically with her confirmed status. Rachel paused briefly at the threshold, not as a delay, but as a natural completion point of transition between secured corridors and the main judicial environment, where her role shifted from movement within the system to full presence within its highest functional space. A final internal signal passed through the courthouse network, confirming complete integration of her arrival into the active judicial session framework, and all remaining procedural elements settled into place without further instruction. Derek, now fully outside the operational sequence, observed from a distance as the internal structure of the courthouse functioned without interruption or uncertainty, the earlier tension at the entrance now replaced by a clear and irreversible recognition of authority alignment. Inside the chamber, Rachel stepped forward into the designated position prepared for her, her presence acknowledged across all internal systems without announcement, as the courthouse completed its transition into formal session readiness under her confirmed judicial oversight. The courthouse chamber had fully transitioned into a state of formal judicial readiness, where every structural element, from seating arrangement to internal communication channels, reflected complete alignment with the confirmed authority now present within the room. Rachel Williams stood at the designated position at the front of the chamber, her presence acknowledged across all active systems without the need for verbal announcement, as if the building itself had already completed the recognition process before any human interaction could begin. The atmosphere inside the chamber was quiet, but it was not empty. It carried the weight of structured anticipation, the kind that emerges when procedural certainty replaces uncertainty at every operational level. Court staff maintained precise positions along the perimeter, their attention focused not on questioning, but on execution of established protocol, ensuring that every aspect of the session environment was fully prepared. Officer Derek Collins remained outside the chamber corridor, no longer part of the active sequence, his earlier role now reduced to observation from a distance, where the full implications of the situation had become increasingly clear without the need for explanation. Inside, a senior judicial coordinator stepped forward briefly, confirming final readiness through a subtle hand signal that indicated complete synchronization across all administrative and security layers. Rachel's posture remained steady and composed, her focus directed forward, as if acknowledging the transition from movement into full judicial presence within the highest level of the state court system. Across the chamber, systems responsible for documentation, recording, and procedural oversight activated in coordinated sequence, ensuring that every aspect of the upcoming session was properly aligned with her authority classification. The doors behind her closed quietly, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a final procedural step marking the completion of secure entry protocol. Derek, still positioned near the outer corridor, observed the final stage of this transition without interruption, his earlier attempts at enforcement now entirely irrelevant within the structure that had already been fully activated above his level of control. Inside the chamber, Rachel took a final measured step forward, positioning herself at the center of the judicial space designated for her role, where all systems now operated in unified recognition of her authority. The environment remained silent, but it was a structured silence, one shaped by confirmed procedure rather than uncertainty or hesitation. A final internal confirmation signal passed through the courthouse network, indicating that the session was now fully under judicial activation and ready for formal proceedings to begin. Rachel remained composed, her presence steady and unshaken, as the entire structure of the courthouse aligned around her position, marking the completion of a transition that had begun outside the entrance and now reached its final state within the highest chamber of authority.